Stop. What were you just thinking about? Were you thinking in words? If so, they probably sounded like yours. They had your pitch, tempo, accent, cadence, and so on. Moreover, that thought was connected to what you were feeling in your environment, and in general, you would say that that thought, like all of your thoughts, came from you. Right? Yet, many things in life exist on a spectrum. For example, sometimes you'll be busy in the flow of something, and then suddenly your attention shifts to your thoughts, where you'll stumble in on your mind talking to itself about what you have to do today, or your significant other, or even some flight of fancy. Even though you didn't intend to have those thoughts, they don't feel out of the ordinary for you, so we'll call those yours too. Once you start talking about conditions like depression and anxiety, things start getting blurry. You'll even hear people use distancing language like, "That's just the depression talking," or "My anxiety is clouding my judgment." Many techniques for managing these conditions, like mindfulness, meditation, DBT, and others, reinforce that distancing by encouraging patients not to identify with their negative feelings, but rather observe them with equanimity and treat them as transient. Of course, other more severe conditions like multiple personality disorder or schizophrenia, thoughts won't even seem to be coming from a thing you'd call you at all. But it's not just the mentally ill who experience this level of dissociation. It's quite common for kids to hear a friendly hallucinatory voice whom they perceive as an imaginary playmate, and writers even report hearing their characters talk to them as if they had their own minds. There's even a forum for adults who hear voices, but in other ways feel their lives are completely normal. Regardless, people today generally believe that their thoughts come from themselves and take place in their own mind. But that wasn't always self-evident. It's well known that ancient Greeks and Romans spoke of emotions as taking place in various parts of the body. We preserve some of those views today as metaphors, like love coming from the heart or intuition coming from the gut. But we don't seriously think that, any more than we think sadness comes from the spleen or anger from the gallbladder. But it makes perfect sense to talk about emotions coming from the body if your concept of the mind and the sorts of things that take place inside of it is less well developed. One of the most fascinating and controversial takes on the nature of the ancient mind came from Princeton psychologist Julian Jaynes, whose seminal work, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, has been equally parts praised and derided for proposing the groundbreaking idea that ancients before the 2nd millennium BCE were primarily guided not by conscious intentional thoughts, but by voices coming from gods, nature, or other external entities. Some of Jaynes' theories have not stood the test of time, such as that ancients' brains were split into two parts, with the left half of the brain perceiving information coming from the right half as auditory hallucinations. Disregarding that, Jaynes still made plenty of astute observations, one of which being that modern scholars often read their own understandings of the modern mind back into ancient Greek texts when translating them. As the ancient Greeks saw it, the conscious mind was split into 8 different parts, to the extent they had anything we would call a modern mind at all, as their functions were much less abstract than the modern minds. Psyche, for example, which Plato and Aristotle used to describe the soul in the 4th century BCE, meant something closer to life substances like blood or breath in the Iliad, which was written down in the late 8th century BCE from oral tradition stretching back yet another 5 centuries. The warrior in the Iliad, for example, was described as bleeding his psyche out after losing in battle, or someone's psyche would escape them upon their last breath. As such, the psyche had no active role in mental action or decision-making. Thumos, which later came to mean the emotional soul, was simply motion or agitation in earlier contexts, which the sea, wind, and even fires could possess. In fact, the proposed Proto-Indo-European root of the word was thumos, meaning smoke, or du, meaning to be in commotion or rise as dust and smoke do. The closest thing ancient Greece had to the modern mind was nous, but it might be better translated as an organ of clear inner vision. After all, Zeus keeps watch over Odysseus by keeping him in his nous, and Penelope cannot observe things when Athena turns her nous away. The origin of the word is uncertain, but one proposal is that it comes from the verb noein, which one study claims is used 80% with respect to visual recognition and 20% of the time with respect to planning and intention. Now, there are cases describing the nous as having properties of a modern mind, like being able to hide one's intentions, but these are actually quite rare in the Iliad. And in fact, nous is mentioned in any context only 46 times, which is surprising for a work of over 150,000 words, especially one centering around war, which requires a high degree of strategy, planning, and, well, conscious thought. So, how do the epic's heroes decide to wage war? Downright passively, it turns out. Modern translations make it seem like leaders are engaged in taking action, such as in this passage where Agamemnon cannot sleep because he is debating so many things in his mind. But if we look at the original passage, it says, "Bolafresin hormainonta," so many things were turning over in his phrenes. The phrenes being a container space in the lungs or diaphragm that could be filled with emotions, thoughts, indecision, or even other parts of the ancient Greek mind like the nous, and was often influenced by the gods. It's not that he's thinking. Thoughts are simply happening to him, which he then becomes aware of. And speaking of gods, many decisions are simply made because a god told someone to do so. As Janes notes, gods start quarrels among men, tell armies to go into battle, and speak to soldiers at critical turning points. When Achilles confronts Agamemnon for stealing his mistress, Agamemnon simply explains Zeus commanded him to do it. So what could I do? Gods always have their way. Achilles doesn't accuse Agamemnon of trying to deflect responsibility. In fact, he fully accepts the explanation. And why wouldn't he when Achilles accepts the same reality? Now, you could interpret all that as poetic license. I mean, this is happening in an epic story. But Jane says the ancients would have taken this quite literally. After all, if thoughts simply occur to people without conscious effort in a mind fragmented into 8 parts, which were often written about as having their own volition and being in conflict with each other, how much of a stretch would it be to say that they sincerely believed that they also heard voices from outside themselves telling them how to act? Now, bear in mind, this wasn't just happening in ancient Greece. Ancients from Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, and others treated the idea of entities living in your head and talking to you as a completely normal experience. And in fact, the further back you go in recorded history, the more you notice that it's not just happening to epic heroes, but to your everyday Joe Schmoes. An ancient Egyptian papyrus thought to date from the 19th century BCE, for example, details how a man argued with his ba, the ba being a collection of things that made a person unique and which could survive death, which here we'll loosely translate as soul. In it, the man starts by grieving that his ba has abandoned him. He is angry that his ba wants him to live and tries to convince it that he would be better off dead. But his ba chides him, questioning if he is a man, and then mocks him for treating death as an accomplishment like wealth. The man then begs his ba to listen to him and tries to placate it by promising a pleasant shelter like the pyramids for it to travel to the afterlife, and then threatens it, saying that if he delays him from death, he will not be able to settle down in the afterlife. What's fascinating here is that there's nothing poetic or epic about this story. It's as if the man is quite literally talking to a separate entity living in his head with its own set of goals and desires. There's nothing metaphorical about this text. It was simply someone's lived experience. So how does Jane's propose all this fell apart and we entered the modern era where the only voice we hear in our head comes from ourselves? Well, Jane says that merchants in the 2nd millennium BCE would have started questioning the god voices in their heads when abroad. These guiding voices were, after all, supposed to be all-knowing, but that only works so long as you're operating in a context where you already know everything you need. What happens when the voice in your head assures you that the customary greeting is a hand gesture, which your foreign counterpart finds offensive, or tells you to present him with a gift of salt when a gift of bronze would have been more appropriate in his culture? Once the gods turn out to be wrong over and over again, or worse still, create social chaos when dealing with people who lack the same basic assumptions about reality, how do you trust them? In place of trusting voices to give them all the answers, traders would have had to have developed a conscious understanding of how someone from far outside their own group would behave. Traders, slowly bringing this new method of understanding back to their own communities, would have decreased people's dependency on voices for answers, and Janes notes that around 1300 BCE, many civilizations in the ancient Near East developed an unprecedented complaint, that the gods no longer spoke to them. One piece of religious art shows Tukulti-Ninurta I, king of Assyria, kneeling before the empty throne of his god. Janes notes that this was previously unprecedented, with prior art showing rulers standing and listening to their god. Other art from this point on shows gods having abandoned Tukulti-Ninurta, who merely approaches symbols of his gods, or noting that they left him altogether. Cuneiform tablets from around the same time are rife with the same lamentation, with one reading, "May the gods who have thrown me off give me help, may the goddess who abandoned me show mercy," and another reading, "My god has forsaken and disappeared, my goddess has failed me and keeps me at a distance, the good angel who walked beside me has departed." These sorts of concerns simply did not show up anywhere in literature prior to this point in history. Now, if foreign journeys spurred traders to develop introspective awareness, the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE would have kicked it into overdrive. The rapid and violent end of all major ancient Near Eastern civilizations would have sent hundreds of thousands of refugees into neighboring empires, where they would have experienced the same realities that traders had been for centuries. The voices in their heads had none of the answers. Jane says that as a result, people turned to oracles and divination, with omen texts proliferating to touch every aspect of life. For example, by 650 BCE, at least 30% of the 20 to 30,000 tablets in the library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh are omens, such as, if a horse enters a man's house and bites either an ass or a man, the owner of the house will die, and his household will be scattered. Or, if a man unwittingly treads on a lizard and kills it, he will prevail over his adversary. Or, if a fox runs into the public square, the town will be devastated. Jane says that these were humanity's first attempts at narratization, or explicitly and consciously attempting to come up with reasons for why things happen. Instead of things happening due to a random voice saying so, people started throwing if-then statements like Jello against the wall, seeing what stuck. Now, although the above examples are exceptionally ridiculous to the modern ear, some omens can be seen as the most primitive, systematic attempts at modern disciplines. Like, if a sick person presents to a doctor in such and such a way, then his treatment should be such and such, being the start of medicine. Or, if it is such and such a month, you should begin such and such an undertaking, being the start of meteorology. Interestingly, Jane notes that it was around the 5th century BCE that horoscopes took shape. As planets were now being used to divine the intention of the now silent gods, this increased celestial observation for astrology is what led to modern astronomy, he adds. Now, if you're anything like me, that blew your mind. But just because it blows your mind doesn't mean it's true, so you have to ask, how likely is all this? To be clear, Jane's research deals exclusively with the ancient Near East, and he doesn't have opinions about whether any other ancient cultures did or did not hear voices as a substitute for conscious thought. But even in modernish times, we have plenty of evidence that some groups of people have taken disembodied voices very seriously, in place of conscious thought, and even at their own peril and against common sense. For example, in 1856, Xhosa prophet Nonkuasa heard spirits telling her to destroy all of her people's crops and cattle so that European invaders would be swept into the sea. She related the prophecy to her uncle, Mlakaza, who recognized one of the spirits as his dead brother, which convinced him she was telling the truth. As her prophecy spread, the Xhosa embarked on a mass slaughter of cattle, culminating in 300 to 400,000 head being killed. When her prophecy failed to come true, followers blamed not the spirits, but the stingy Xhosa, who refused to kill their cattle, despite the Xhosa population collapsing from 105,000 to 27,000 in the wake of a famine. Or take Hongzhu Chang, who in the mid-19th century experienced visions and voices telling him that demons were infesting heaven and that he, as Jesus Christ's younger brother, was to rid China of pagan faiths like Buddhism and Confucianism. He so sincerely believed what he heard that he pressed on to found a rival state to China, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and continued fighting for it even after all supplies were cut off. While besieged, he instructed his followers to eat manna, which in practice ended up being weeds and sweetened dew, which ended up poisoning the leader and ending his kingdom, but not before the Civil War claimed the lives of 20 to 30 million Chinese, or 5 to 10% of the country's then population. Of course, you could say these were classic examples of stress-induced psychosis in the wake of European invasion and the breakdown of pre-existing social norms, but it's not hard to imagine ancients dealing with this level of stress on a regular basis, especially when you consider how much trauma and deprivation even a well-off ancient Greek would have suffered compared to today, with drought, famine, and war commonplace, and essentials like farmland, water, and timber scarce. Stress-induced psychosis would have been reinforced by living in a society that treated hearing voices as normal, whether from the Oracle of Delphi or another family member who themselves claimed to be hearing gods command them to do things. You could also claim that these voice hearers were self-aggrandizing individuals seeking to start movements bringing themselves power and attention, but the fervor with which they held onto their beliefs, even after the odds were entirely against them, paints a different picture. Joan of Arc, for example, could have easily claimed while on trial that the visions she saw telling her to lead the French into battle were merely poetic license, but she was adamant that the voices she heard were real, even at risk of condemnation. Aside from those dramatic cases, other more run-of-the-mill cases exist, such as the Piraha hunter-gatherers of the Amazon basin who regularly hear spirit voices dispensing advice such as "don't hunt downriver tomorrow," or reiterating social norms like "don't eat snakes." Spirit voices like Kawibogi, or Fastmouth, can kill them or give them advice on a whim, or the spirits can take on the form of a plant or animal, but it should be underscored that the Pirahas see spirits in their mind literally. They talk to spirits literally. Whatever anyone else might think of these claims, all Pirahas will say that they experience spirits. Their own beliefs are not in fantastic and miraculous spirits, but in spirits that are in fact creatures of their environment, creatures that do normal sorts of things. Of course, it's not controversial to note that it's normal in some societies, especially in isolated non-Western ones, to hear spirits, but it does become a bit more interesting when you think about it in the broader context, that there would have been a time when this sort of behavior was not the exception but the norm. At least, it shows how groups of people can survive in an exceptionally hostile environment, taking guidance from voices beyond the self. As for Jane's claim that omens spurred intentional and logical thought, in and of itself, it seems like a greater focus on reasoning, even faulty reasoning, would be a step in the right direction. But reasoning certainly didn't begin after people stopped hearing guiding voices. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, written down sometime between 1700 and 1500 BCE, and possibly copied from texts dating back to 2500 BCE, show the same level of medical reasoning as omens written down over a millennium later, with examples even following the same if-then patterns, such as, "If you examine a man with an abscess with prominent head in his breast, I will treat with cold application." Of course, most texts from this era have been lost to the sands of time, so it's hard to say how common this line of thinking would have been. And while something like knowing how to make fire and keep it going wouldn't necessarily require high-level reasoning, it's hard to imagine monuments, water management systems, urban planning, or ziggurats and pyramids being constructed based on the whim of a voice in somebody's head. And what of his claim that ancient Greeks of the Iliad didn't have a conscious mind? No one doubts that their self-perception differed radically from ours, but even primates can engage in deception and adjust their behavior based on their anticipation of how other members of their group will behave. That is to say, they have a theory of mind, which is certainly an important prerequisite for consciousness. If monkeys can understand how other monkeys will behave, why would Agamemnon leave his battle planning to voices in his head and not his own understanding of warfare mechanics? Now, you might say that he indeed did have a theory of mind, but outsourced it to the voices in his head, but that claim is really unfalsifiable. Besides, Odysseus clearly knows how to use deception, having hidden his forces in the Trojan horse. But on the other hand, Odysseus is presented as some sort of tactical genius for coming up with an idea that would barely fool a 5-year-old today. Perhaps after millennia of life in city-states, with people fulfilling their role in their social strata like cogs in a machine and rarely interacting with outsiders, people's theory of mind would have weakened. I don't know. So, what do you think of all this? Was Jane's a genius or a crackpot? Have you ever heard voices in your head that seem to come from somewhere else? And if so, could you relate any of your experience to this? I'm actually super curious to know, so feel free to leave your experiences or thoughts about all this in the comments, and I'll try to respond to everyone. For now, have a good evening.